dark ocean, empty horizon. And in the middle of all that, nothing. A tiny ship that everyone said didn't matter. June 4th, 1943, North Atlantic. 700 miles east of Newfoundland, the sea is angry. 20-foot swells smash into a short, stubby carrier that looks more like a floating warehouse than a warship. Her name is USS Bogue. Not a proud fleet carrier like Enterprise or Yorktown. She's an escort carrier, smaller, slower, lightly armed, with a wooden flight deck bolted onto what used to be a merchant ship hull. On paper, she's a compromise. In the eyes of many admirals, she's an embarrassment. Up on the flight deck, crewmen cling to safety lines as the ship's bow vanishes into the waves and then reappears, slamming upward in walls of spray. They wrestle a TBF Avenger into position, wings folded out, engine screaming against the wind. Every takeoff from this tiny deck is a gamble. Too early, and the plane stalls into the sea. Too late, and it runs out of deck. But they do it anyway, because somewhere out there, beneath the gray Atlantic, a submarine is hunting. Hundreds of miles away, in air-conditioned offices at Japanese Combined Fleet headquarters, men in crisp uniforms study reports on ships like Bogue and laugh. To them, these little carriers are a joke. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his staff have been raised on the idea of the decisive battle, one massive clash of battleships and fleet carriers that will determine control of the ocean. In that world, only the biggest ships matter. The fastest, the most heavily armed, the most glorious. Escort carriers are none of those things. They're too slow to keep up with battle fleets, too small to launch big, striking waves, too lightly built to survive serious punishment. Emergency conversions, they call them. Proof, they think, that America is getting desperate. What they don't see, what almost nobody sees yet, is that the war at sea is changing. Not in a single, dramatic, movie-worthy battle, but in endless patrols, gray skies, cold decks, and long hours where nothing happens until suddenly everything does. This is a story about ships that were never meant to be heroes. Ships that were supposed to just escort convoys and stay out of the way. Ships that fleet carrier pilots joked about, right up until those baby flat tops started racking up submarine kills and quietly changing the course of the war. It's also a story about the people on board them. Pilots who flew long, lonely anti-submarine patrols over empty ocean, knowing that one engine failure or navigation mistake meant dying alone in the water. Radar operators staring at blurry green screens, trying to spot a submarine in a flicker of static. Deck crews who launched and recovered aircraft on a postage-stamped flight deck that heaved like a roller coaster in a storm. No parades, no headlines. Just the quiet courage of doing a dangerous, exhausting job every single day, because if they didn't, merchant ships would burn, soldiers would starve, and the war might be lost far from any battlefield. The Japanese admirals mocked America's escort carriers. Within 18 months, those weak little ships would help crush the submarine forces that Germany and Japan were counting on, and prove that in modern war, sometimes the smallest, ugliest ship on the horizon is the one that decides everything. This is the courage of the escort carrier. This is WW2 courage. How America turned merchant ships into submarine killers, the birth of the escort carrier. When the first escort carrier slid into the water, nobody mistook it for a masterpiece. It didn't have the sleek lines of a fleet carrier. It didn't thunder across the ocean at 30 knots. It didn't carry dozens of dive bombers and torpedo planes ready to smash a battle fleet. If anything, it looked improvised. And in a sense, it was. But that improvisation came from something far more dangerous than desperation. It came from industrial clarity, a brutally honest understanding of what the war actually required. To understand why escort carriers mattered, you have to go back to 1941, when the North Atlantic was bleeding. The Atlantic crisis that changed everything. Before Pearl Harbor, before Midway, before the island-hopping campaigns, another war was already raging. The battle for the lifeline between North America and Britain. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships so quickly that Churchill himself wrote he feared the U-boat peril is the only thing that ever frightened me. The problem wasn't just the submarines. It was the ocean itself. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, a huge region out of reach of land-based aircraft, was basically a hunting preserve for German submarines. Convoys entered that region knowing they would have no air cover for days. And a convoy without aircraft is a convoy waiting to die. Destroyers could chase shadows. Merchants could only run and pray. So the British, desperate for any solution, took a captured German merchant ship, ripped off the cargo gear, slapped a runway on top, and created HMS Audacity, the world's first escort carrier. She carried 6 aircraft. She lasted 6 months. She was sunk in December 1941. But in her short career, she proved something revolutionary. Even a tiny deck with a handful of fighters could turn a convoy from prey into a force that could hunt back. The concept worked. All it needed was someone who could take that idea and mass produce it with terrifying scale. Enter the United States. America's industrial machine wakes up. When American planners studied the British experiment, they didn't see a temporary patch. They saw a blueprint for an entirely new class of warship, one that didn't need to be perfect, only present. The U.S. Maritime Commission looked at its shipyards and asked a radical question. What if we don't build them like warships at all? What if we build them like cargo ships and then make them into warships? Normal carriers required precision steelwork, specialized hulls, complex elevators, heavy armor, and years of construction time. America didn't have years. Merchant ships were burning now. But the U.S. already had dozens of C-3 cargo ship hulls under construction, large, steady platforms meant for ocean crossings. And someone finally said the obvious. Why not just turn those into carriers? So that's exactly what they did. The birth of the mass-produced warship. The conversion process was wild by pre-war naval standards. Step 1. Take a cargo hull. Step 2. Weld a flight deck on top. Step 3. Add a small hangar, 1 elevator, 1 catapult, and whatever guns were available. Step 4. Call it a carrier. Traditional admirals hated it. Shipbuilders loved it. What emerged became the Bow class, the first mass-produced escort carriers of the U.S. Navy. They were 512 feet long, displaced about 11,000 tons, and carried roughly 28 aircraft. Not a big punch, not a glamorous ship, but they could be built fast. The true miracle, however, came next. Once the concept worked, America didn't just convert merchant ships. It began designing escort carriers from the keel up. The result was a legendary Casablanca class, the most numerous aircraft carrier class ever built, 50 ships in 18 months. Let that sink in. While Japan struggled to produce even a handful of escort carriers, most of which weren't true carriers at all, American shipyards were launching a new one almost every week. At the Kaiser Vancouver Yard, a Casablanca carrier averaged 250,000 man-hours to build, 8-10 days between launches, around 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. A fleet carrier took 2 to 3 years. These weren't works of art. They weren't meant to be. They were weapons of coverage, saturating the ocean with flight decks, designed for the mission, not for prestige. Critics pointed to the escort carrier's flaws. Slow, 19 knots, thinly armored, small air groups, wooden flight decks, minimal weapons, vulnerable to torpedoes, hopeless alone against surface ships. All true, all irrelevant, because they weren't designed to fight battleships. They weren't designed to trade blows with elite carrier groups. They were designed to do one thing the war desperately needed: keep airplanes in the sky over the ocean constantly, endlessly, everywhere. And for that, numbers mattered more than elegance. Against submarines, a 19-knot carrier is just as deadly as a 33-knot one. Against convoy raiders, a single Wildcat in the air could mean life or death for dozens of ships. Against U-boats waiting on the surface at night, radar-equipped Avengers were a nightmare. Escort carriers didn't need speed. They needed presence. And they delivered it across millions of square miles. The American transformation, from defense to dominance. By early 1943, something subtle but powerful, had changed. Convoys that once crept through the Atlantic began moving with confidence. Hunter-killer groups roamed the ocean like packs of wolves. Beaucard, Croatan, Core, names barely known then, but feared in U-boat message traffic. And while fleets of escort carriers guarded shipping lanes, others ferried aircraft to forward bases, supported amphibious landings, and patrolled the Pacific. The numbers tell the real story. 127 escort carriers built by the U.S., over 300,000 sorties flown, more than 60 submarines sunk or assisted, tens of thousands of aircraft delivered, countless convoys saved. Compare that with Japan. 7 escort carriers total, mostly transports, no mass production capability, no doctrine for convoy protection. Japan treated escort carriers as an afterthought. America treated them as a strategic foundation. One nation built for decisive battles, the other built for decisive coverage. Only one approach could win a global naval war. Hunter-killer groups, how tiny carriers turned the ocean into a trap. By the spring of 1943, the escort carrier wasn't just a ship anymore. It was the beating heart of a new kind of naval warfare. Before that, the ocean had been the submarines' playground. German U-boats prowled the waves at night, surfaced to charge batteries, hunted convoys, and slipped beneath the waves before destroyers could react. Japanese submarines, larger, longer-legged, and trained for offensive naval strikes, moved confidently through the Pacific. Submarines were the hunters. America was the hunted. That balance ended the moment escort carriers and hunter-killer groups appeared. This wasn't an evolution of surface warfare. It was a revolution. Find, fix, finish. The doctrine that changed everything. A hunter-killer group, known to sailors as an hook group, wasn't just a task force. It was a machine with moving parts that depended on each other perfectly. The core was the escort carrier. Its aircraft were the eyes, ears, and claws, covering distances no destroyer could chase. The carrier's Avengers flew slow, steady patrols across thousands of square miles, looking for the telltale signs of a submarine. A periscope wake, a shadow under the surface, a radar blip just above the waves, the faint clack-clack of a diesel engine picked up by sonobuoys. They hunted submarines not by luck, but by system. The destroyer escorts were the hammer. While aircraft could spot, track, and attack, destroyer escorts carried the weapons that finished the job. Sonar systems for precise underwater tracking, depth charges for area saturation, hedgehog mortars for pinpoint killing, high speed to chase down subs trying to slip away. A submarine that dove to escape an aircraft was simply handing itself to the surface ships. A submarine that surfaced to escape destroyers was handing itself back to the Avengers. There was no exit. This tactic wasn't theoretical. It was tested, refined, and repeated until it became a rhythm. Find, fix, finish, hours, sometimes days, until the submarine either sank or surrendered. Hunter-killer groups weren't glamorous. They weren't fast. They weren't elegant. But they were inevitable. USS Bogue, the first great U-boat killer. When USS Bogue sailed into the mid-Atlantic in 1943, nobody expected much. She carried fewer planes than a Japanese light carrier and moved slower than most warships in the Atlantic. But she had something U-boats feared more than guns: constant air cover. On the 22nd of March 1943, Bogue found her first victim, U-663. Aircraft spotted her on the surface, marked her, and forced her down. Destroyer escorts attacked until she rose again, crippled, and was finished off by gunfire. It was the first of 13 kills attributed to Bogue's group. 13 for a ship Japan dismissed as insignificant. Submariners in the North Atlantic began calling escort carriers flat-top wolves. And for the first time, U-boat commanders felt what it was like to be hunted. The technology that made it deadly. Hunter-killer groups worked not only because of tactics, but because of tools that submarines weren't prepared for. ASV radar. Mounted under the wing of an Avenger, this radar could spot a submarine's conning tower at more than 10 miles long before the sub's lookouts could see the plane. One blip on radar could end a submarine's patrol. Sonobuoys. Dropping sonobuoys in patterns transformed the ocean into a listening field. A diesel engine running miles away might as well have been a drum in a quiet room. Submarines could no longer hide in silence. Hedgehog mortars. Unlike depth charges, which exploded near a target, hedgehogs exploded on contact. A destroyer escort could maintain sonar contact while firing. If even one projectile hit the sub's hull, the kill was instant. Fido, the acoustic torpedo. This was the final boss of anti-submarine warfare. Dropped from an airplane, it didn't chase a ship. It chased sound. A submarine's propellers were its doom. Even if a submarine dove deep, even if it zigzagged, even if it shut off its engines too late, Fido would find it. Many submariners never saw it coming. The psychological war below the waves. What made hunter-killer groups so devastating wasn't only that they destroyed submarines, it was the fear they inflicted. German and Japanese survivors described the same nightmare. You hear the aircraft engine overhead first. You dive. You wait. The pings of sonar begin. Then the depth charges. Everything shakes. Metal screams. Lights flicker. The air grows thick, hot, unbreathable. Hours pass. Then more hours. Battery power fades. CO2 rises. The crew begins to panic. Some faint. Some vomit. Some pray. All while the enemy above never leaves. Many submarines weren't sunk in clean attacks. They were sunk by exhaustion forced too deep until their hulls collapsed. Hunter-killer groups didn't just defeat submarines. They broke them. The Pacific, a new ocean, same nightmare. By 1944, Atlantic U-boats were dying faster than Germany could replace them, so escort carriers turned west. The Pacific was different. Longer patrol distances. Fewer convoys. More scattered submarine operations. Japanese subs focused on offensive strikes, not shipping lanes, but hunter-killer tactics adapted instantly. Escort carriers like USS Guadalcanal, USS Hogget Bay, and USS Anzio began sweeping the ocean between Hawaii, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. Submarines that once stalked American task forces suddenly found themselves stalked instead. I-52, carrying gold to Germany, was hunted and sunk by Bogue's Avengers using radar and Fido. I-26, famous for sinking USS Juno, was hunted down after aircraft vectored destroyers to her location. Hunter-killer groups didn't just kill submarines. They erased experienced crews Japan could not replace. The turning point, when submarines stopped fighting back. By early 1945, a shift had occurred that no one predicted in 1942. Submarines, once the apex predators of the sea, became ghosts. They hid. They avoided combat. They ran from convoys instead of attacking them. The Pacific supply lines, once threatened, became safe highways of troops, fuel, and equipment. The Japanese submarine force was effectively dead. The German U-boat arm was collapsing. And the escort carrier, small, cheap, mocked, had become one of the most strategically important ships of the entire war. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, how escort carriers became the backbone of America's war machine. When escort carriers first sailed into the Atlantic, they were specialists built to hunt submarines, guard convoys, and keep the sea lanes alive. Nobody thought they would ever be used for anything else. But the war didn't care what they were meant to be. The war needed ships everywhere, and America had more of these little carriers than anyone dreamed possible. So when the U-boat threat began collapsing in mid-1944, the escort carrier received a new order, one that would redefine its legacy. Head west. The Pacific, vast, scattered, violent, was calling. A different ocean, a different war. The Atlantic was a chessboard of shipping lanes and narrow battles of endurance. The Pacific was something entirely different. A nightmare of distance, island fortresses, and skies filled with enemy aircraft. Escort carriers built for slow Atlantic convoys now faced. Thousands of miles of open ocean. Aggressive Japanese land-based aviation. Kamikaze attacks. the need to support amphibious invasions on shores packed with artillery. Many admirals doubted these baby carriers could survive. Some thought they were being thrown into a fire they couldn't withstand. But in the Pacific, the escort carrier would prove something incredible. Sometimes adaptability matters more than design. USS Guadalcanal and the art of relentless pursuit. Before heading west, one escort carrier demonstrated that these ships weren't just adequate, they could be exceptional. USS Guadalcanal, led by Captain Daniel V. Gallery, wrote the book on tactical aggression. His philosophy was simple. Every contact is prosecuted. No excuses, no weather cancellations. A submarine runs only when he's dead. His hunter-killer group famously captured U-5 105 inches 1,944, the first U.S. capture of an enemy warship since 1815. This victory wasn't luck, it was doctrine. Tireless patrols, vicious follow-through, and coordination that bordered on obsessive. The same style of warfare, constant pressure, endless sorties would become the escort carrier trademark in the Pacific. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the escort carrier arrives under fire. During the invasion of the Marianas in mid-1944, escort carriers were given responsibilities usually reserved for fleet carriers. 1. Combat Air Patrol, CAP. FM-2 Wildcats flew defensive screens to intercept Japanese scouts and bombers hunting the invasion fleet. 2. Anti-submarine patrol, ASP. Avengers upheld the old mission, keeping subs away from transports and battleships. 3. Close Air Support CAS. When Marines called for help ashore, escort carriers delivered bombs, rockets, and strafing runs within minutes. Fleet carriers were too busy fighting the Japanese main force. The baby carriers had to carry the load. USS Anzio, guarding the Saipan invasion fleet, flew around-the-clock missions, sometimes more than 100 sorties in a day. Her pilots chased submarines, shot down enemy aircraft, hit gun positions on the beaches, and still had to sleep on the flight deck because hangar space was full. These ships were getting pushed way beyond their intended design. But they kept delivering. The escort carrier superpower, being everywhere at once. Because escort carriers were so numerous, commanders used them like utility knives wherever something was needed. A baby flat top could fill the gap. They delivered replacement aircraft to fleet carriers after battle, ferried supplies to forward bases, carried wounded Marines home, flew anti-kamikaze patrols, supported mine-sweeping operations, hunted the last Japanese submarines hiding in deep waters.
They became the logistical backbone of every major operation from 1944 onward. Fleet carriers won headlines. Escort carriers won the war behind the scenes. The Philippines' escort carriers faced their nightmare. The real test came in October 1944, in a place that would become legend, Leyte Gulf. It was the largest naval battle in history, 4 major engagements, dozens of fleets clashing across hundreds of miles. And in one of those battles, Samar, escort carriers were thrown into the crucible. The battle off Samar, David versus Goliath on the open sea, setting the stage task unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Their mission? Provide close air support for the Leyte landings. Nothing else. They were never meant to fight capital ships. At dawn on October 25th, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Central Force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, burst through the fog of rain and smoke, directly behind Taffy 3. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and slower by nearly 15 knots. Kurita had the perfect opportunity to slaughter the escort carriers and smash the American invasion fleet. And yet, that didn't happen. Launch everything, anything, now. Escort carrier flight decks exploded into chaos. Pilots sprinted to aircraft armed for anti-submarine missions. Depth charges, small rockets, even empty pylons. No time to rearm, no time to think. They took off anyway. Wildcats armed with nothing but machine guns dove at heavy cruisers. Avengers carrying depth charges dropped them like bombs. Others flew low to distract the Japanese, forcing cruisers to zigzag and breaking their formations. Meanwhile, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, Johnston, Howell, Heermann, Samuel B. Roberts, charged the Japanese line with torpedoes and suicidal attacks, buying the escort carriers time. Smoke screens bloomed across the ocean. Gunfire crashed like thunder. Aircraft darted in and out of the clouds like angry insects. The weak escort carriers refused to die. Kurita withdraws. Shock across two navies. After hours of attacks, chaotic, desperate, relentless, Kurita hesitated. He was convinced he was facing fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The ferocity of the counterattack misled him completely. He turned back. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had left retreated, from 6 escort carriers and a few destroyers. Taffy 3 paid a terrible price. 3 destroyers sunk, 1 escort carrier, Gambier Bay, lost, nearly 1,000 sailors dead. But they saved the invasion of the Philippines. They saved the Pacific Campaign. They saved tens of thousands of troops. And they proved something undeniable. Courage can outweigh tonnage. After Samar, a new role, a new reputation. Escort carriers that survived Samar were repaired and sent right back into action. Sometimes within weeks they continued, providing close air support, smashing kamikaze attacks, ferrying aircraft to Okinawa, hunting the last Japanese submarines, supporting minesweeping and occupation operations. By 1945, they were everywhere except the history books, until now. By the final year of the Pacific War, the escort carrier had quietly become one of the most indispensable assets in the entire American arsenal. Not because it was beautiful or powerful, but because it was always there, everywhere, filling the wide, empty spaces of the ocean with the constant thrum of propellers and the watchful glare of radar screens. While the mighty fleet carriers chased glory in great battles, the escort carriers did the unglamorous work that held the entire war effort together. Flying thousands of sorties that never made headlines, patrolling shipping lanes that no one remembered, and supporting invasions where every inch of sand had to be fought for with blood and steel. Their presence at Leyte Gulf had already proven that courage and persistence could make even the smallest ships punch far above their weight. But the months that followed demonstrated something equally important, that the escort carrier was, in many ways, the perfect ship for the brutal, grinding, logistical nature of the Pacific Campaign. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they flew constant close air support missions, guiding Marines through volcanic ash and mud, blasting pillboxes, torching caves, and intercepting kamikaze aircraft before they could reach the crowded invasion beaches. It was dirty, exhausting flying, low-level, dangerous, repetitive, and yet the baby flat tops delivered again and again. When a fleet carrier needed fresh aircraft after a major engagement, it was an escort carrier that arrived with replacement Wildcats and Avengers stacked wingtip to wingtip on the deck. When frontline airfields were cratered or unusable, it was the escort carriers that ferried supplies, fuel, and personnel. When minefields had to be cleared before a landing, their planes flew overwatch for minesweeping ships creeping along the coast. Slowly, steadily, the escort carrier transformed from a convoy escort ship into an all-purpose backbone of the Pacific Fleet. And yet, behind all that effectiveness lurked the brutal truth that these ships were vulnerable by design. Their thin hulls and wooden decks offered almost no protection against torpedoes or kamikaze strikes, and when disaster hit, it hit hard. 5 escort carriers were sunk in the war, and more than 700 American sailors died aboard them. Men who had volunteered for service on ships that many considered second-rate. But to the sailors who stood watch on those small decks, nothing about their mission felt second-rate. They knew that every submarine they forced under, every convoy they shepherded across the Pacific, every airstrike they launched to protect Marines on black volcanic beaches was a link in the chain that strangled Japan's war effort. And on the other side, the experience was far darker. Japanese submarine crews, hunted relentlessly by aircraft and destroyer escorts working in perfect coordination, suffered more than 80% casualties, the highest of any major branch of Japan's military. Many died not in quick explosions, but in the slow agony of pressure, darkness, carbon dioxide buildup, and psychological collapse as they were driven deeper and deeper by unending depth charge patterns. Survivors described the terror of listening to aircraft above them for hours, of feeling the submarine buck and groan under stress, of waiting for the final attack they believed was inevitable. This was the true impact of the escort carrier. Not only the submarine sunk, but the submarines denied freedom to move, to hunt, to breathe. Every patrol sector covered by Avengers and Wildcats became a dead zone no submarine wanted to enter. And as American industrial power continued to surge, the escort carrier became the ultimate symbol of a war Japan could no longer hope to win. While Japan struggled to build even 7 escort carriers, most of them barely functional, America put 50 Casablanca-class carriers into the water in just a year and a half. The contrast was staggering. A nation still crafting ships like artisanal treasures versus a nation building them like automobiles on an assembly line. Kaiser's Vancouver yard launched a new escort carrier every 8 to 10 days, a rhythm that no Axis power could match. This wasn't just industry, it was strategy. Proof that America understood the real nature of the war, a war of logistics, range, replacement, and endurance. And when the fighting finally ended in 1945, the escort carriers did not simply fade into irrelevance. Many continued into Korea, providing close air support for UN forces. Their construction techniques, modular assembly, prefabricated sections, parallel production lines, influenced post-war shipbuilding around the world. And in a profound twist of history, the same Japan whose admirals once mocked the baby flat tops adopted American mass production techniques in the post-war decades, becoming a global shipbuilding titan. Yet the truest legacy of the escort carriers lives not in shipyards or battle reports, but in the quiet courage of the crews who sailed them. These were men who launched aircraft off flight decks barely longer than a football field, who fought storms and enemy fire in ships that shook like tin cans, who spent endless hours scanning gray horizons for periscope wakes or glints of sunlight on wings, who faced the contempt of fleet carrier pilots and proved them wrong through sheer consistency and results. They didn't get the glory. They didn't get the headlines, but they got the job done, over and over, until the ocean belonged to them. Their story is the story of World War II at its core. Not brilliance, not spectacle, but relentless effort by ordinary people using ordinary tools to achieve extraordinary results. That is the courage of the escort carrier. That is their legacy. In the end, the story of the escort carrier is not really about ships at all. It's about a clash between two ways of thinking, between a vision of war built on spectacle, decisive blows, and elite units, and a vision built on endurance, coverage, and the quiet grind of logistics. The Japanese admirals who dismissed these small carriers as improvised, second-rate conversions were not fools. They were prisoners of their own doctrine, trapped in the shadow of Tsushima, and convinced that naval history would repeat itself in one grand, decisive battle. They built immaculate fleet carriers, trained superb aviators, and imagined victory as a single, perfectly executed stroke of brilliance out on the open sea. What they failed to see was that by the 1940s, the ocean had been transformed into something much larger and harsher than the battlefield they'd studied on paper. It was no longer just a stage for dueling battle fleets. It was a global circulatory system, moving oil, steel, food, men, and machines across thousands of miles. Whoever controlled that circulation would win the war, not simply by sinking enemy warships, but by ensuring their own war economy could breathe while the enemy's slowly suffocated escort carriers were not designed to win glory. They were designed to win that kind of war. They took hulls meant for hauling cargo and turned them into launch pads for aircraft that could patrol the empty spaces between continents, hunting submarines, shielding convoys, and answering calls for help from soldiers pinned on black volcanic beaches. Their wooden decks, thin armor, and small air groups made them vulnerable and unimpressive on paper. But in the missions that actually mattered day after day, they were exactly what the situation demanded. Cheap enough to build in huge numbers, simple enough to crew and maintain, flexible enough to perform whatever roles the front lines required. They hunted U-boats in the gray misery of the North Atlantic until German submarine crews learned to dread the faint hum of a distant engine and the ping of a searching sonar. They shifted to the Pacific and became flying artillery for Marines clawing their way up cliffs and through caves on islands with names like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They stood in the path of battleships at Samar, launching aircraft loaded with the wrong weapons but the right determination, proving that courage and aggression could make even the smallest carriers look, for a moment, like giants. And all the while, American industry kept building more of them, 127 in total, until the very scale of that production sent its own message. This was a nation that understood war not as a duel, but as a test of systems, factories, training pipelines, and logistics chains reaching from assembly lines to far-flung anchorages. The escort carrier was the physical embodiment of that understanding. It also exposed the human side of industrial warfare in the starkest possible terms. On one side, American crews serving on ships that many of their own Navy's officers looked down upon, flying missions that seemed repetitive and unromantic. Anti-submarine sweeps over empty ocean, constant combat air patrols, endless convoy coverage where nothing seemed to happen, until the one day when a blip on a radar screen or a periscope wake in rough seas turned routine into chaos. On the other side, German and Japanese submariners enduring a kind of psychological punishment that few on the surface could imagine. Trapped in steel tubes, listening to propellers circling above, and the steady, inescapable rhythm of sonar pings that meant they had been found. Feeling the hull groan as depth charges walked closer and closer. Watching exhaustion and fear crack even experienced officers after days of being hunted. Victory in this environment wasn't clean or glorious. It was cumulative, built from thousands of sorties that found nothing and a few that found everything. From convoys that arrived safely and left no story behind, from submarines that never returned to port and were simply marked overdue, presumed lost. And yet, when the war ended and the world tried to make sense of what had happened, it was the big ships and big battles that filled the popular imagination. Pearl Harbor, Midway, Yamato's Last Stand, the towering decks of fleet carriers like Enterprise and Lexington. The escort carriers remained mostly in the background of public memory, just as they had been in the background of the war. Always there, always working, rarely noticed. But if you strip away the romance and look at the war the way a logistician or a strategist would, their importance becomes impossible to ignore. They were proof that good enough in huge quantities can be far more decisive than perfect in very small numbers. They showed that specialized ships, optimized ruthlessly for specific missions, could outperform expensive, multi-purpose vessels tied up in a few critical engagements. They demonstrated that courage doesn't only appear in dramatic duels between battleships, but also in the quiet discipline of standing watch on a freezing, spray-soaked flight deck, in the patience of a radar operator scanning static for hours, in the stubborn refusal of a small carrier group to run when a vastly superior enemy force looms over the horizon. The legacy of the escort carriers lived on not just in the light carriers, helicopter carriers, and amphibious assault ships that followed, but in a deeper lesson that still shapes military thinking today. In a long war, the side that can adapt its industry, simplify its tools, and flood the battle space with enough at the right places and times will usually defeat the side chasing perfection. The Japanese admirals were right about one thing. Escort carriers were not impressive ships. They were small, they were slow, they were vulnerable, but they were also everywhere. And in a global war, everywhere wins. That is the final truth of their story. That is the courage we remember, not the courage of the biggest ships, but of the smallest ones that refuse to break.